Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to our Healthcare Emergency Preparedness Series session this morning. I'm going to kind of give everybody a few more minutes to log in, and we will get started, get rolling. I had to give it another minute at least. Too good of a song to cut it short, right? So, welcome everybody this morning. Really excited to have you all here. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedules. I want to do some quick introductions and talk about the session this morning. So one of the big things I want everybody to know is we are trying to make this an interactive session. I know we all kind of miss in-person interactions and Q&A. So I have an amazing team backing me up this morning to try to make this as interactive and as fun as possible as we go through and talk about some of the topics this morning. So with me this morning, I have Sarah Myers, who is our digital marketing specialist for BluSky. She's going to be kind of watching the chat box, talking back and forth, and then she's going to be monitoring the Q&A portion of this. So if this is your first Zoom webinar, we do want you to go ahead and kind of look at your controls, and you're going to see that little box that says Q&A. If you have any questions throughout the presentation or after, that's where we want you to put those questions, and Sarah will feed those to me throughout, and we will try to follow up and get to as many as we can today. So feel free to use that. We're also going to be doing some polls, and with us we have Jordan Clark, who is going to be putting up polls throughout the session. She is our training coordinator for BluSky, so she's going to be doing this a little bit interactive as well. So with that said, we want to go ahead and throw up our first poll and find out, for those of you who have been on here, how many of you have attended a BluSky webinar before? Love seeing those numbers come in real quick. It's awesome. All right. All right, perfect. So looks like we've got several folks with us for the first time. So big welcome out to you all. And with that said, we're going to go ahead and get started with the session. All right. So jumping right in here, give you a little bit of background on myself. My name is Chuck Lane, and I'm the Director of Training and Education for BluSky Restoration Contractors. Previous to this, I worked in the healthcare field for about 14 years, doing emergency management for a large healthcare system here in the Memphis, Tennessee area, where I am currently based out of. Most of my background focused on multiple hospitals. We had 5 adult hospitals, a pediatric facility, clinics, home hospice, hospice residents. Worked on the Mid-South Executive Committee for Emergency Preparedness, dealing with kind of the entire Mid-South region, which is Tennessee, Mississippi, and Arkansas. A lot of familiarity with Joint Commission and DNV, CMS rule implementations. We're going to talk a little bit about some of that today. I also work for FEMA as a contract instructor for the Center for Domestic Preparedness in Anniston, Alabama. Get down there a few times a year to teach a variety of different classes. So always excited to talk about these topics, and especially after the year we had with 2020, I think a lot of this is going to be really relevant to you all today. So here's where we want to start making this a little interactive, and would love to see you all jump in the chat box with some quick answers for this. So when we talk about emergencies versus disaster, I want to see what kind of pops into your mind. When I said that we had an emergency at the hospital or emergency in the community today, what kind of things do you think about when you think of an emergency? And then what kind of things do you think about when you see the word disaster pop up? So as we kind of start talking about these, the definitions are important, because there's going to be a lot of different interpretations of these things and how we view an emergency versus a disaster. So an emergency is any circumstance that calls for an immediate action, right? So these are things that happen that you need to address fairly quickly to keep it from getting any worse. A disaster, on the other hand, is something that is going to kind of overwhelm our resources, right? This is where we have to start reaching out and getting additional help. Maybe our normal teams are just overwhelmed. One of the quickest expiring resources is personnel. So people get overwhelmed. We've run out of equipment, whatever it is, we need to call somebody else in. So when we think about disasters as a whole, hurricanes, tornadoes, wildfires, pandemics, all these different things required us to begin reaching out to different agencies, and state emergency management agencies get involved, all these different groups. But what we don't talk about a lot are those day-to-day emergencies where the state's not really getting involved, and the federal government's not coming out. And this is what we really want to focus on today: is how do we handle those kind of site level disasters. Now, natural disasters, going to tell you something interesting today. There's really no such thing as a natural disaster. It's kind of this term that we've come up with and created because truly these are natural events that just occur, right? If a hurricane hits an uninhabited island, not really so much of a disaster, right? They only become natural disasters when a natural event meets a human population, right? So this is a picture of one of my first big disasters that I responded to, which was the floods in Memphis in 2011, kind of all along the Midwest. The Mississippi River crested its banks. And ironically enough, where that water is over is called Riverside Drive in Memphis. Now, man-made events are a little bit different. These are a little bit more difficult to predict. They can happen without warning, and they can have major impacts kind of beyond just the immediate event. So for any of you who live near train tracks where things are constantly moving up and down the rail lines, a lot of hazardous materials, a lot of concerns again about terrorism events, active shooters, all these different things that can kind of impact our operations. And we're going to talk about both of these types of events today, but we're going to focus not so much on these large scale catastrophic events as some of these smaller events that happen fairly frequently, happen continuously, and how do we get some best practices together to prepare for those. So I'd love, again, to be a little interactive, get some examples of what are internal emergencies or disasters to you all. What are these things that happen at your facilities, not necessarily daily, weekly, monthly, but maybe that you've experienced in your career, right? What are these things that pop up and cause major disruptions to our normal operations? And so here's some just general examples, and these are a few things we're going to talk about today. Fires, always a large scale concern. Utility failures cause major disruptions in patient care. Severe weather, after the past few weeks we've had in the Midwest and the South with the freeze events that happened across the majority of the country. These are all things that cause short-term and long-term problems. Earthquakes, active shooters, bomb threats, all things that we want to kind of be prepared for, right? But what about external events? Now, external events are things that happen outside of the facility, but they can still impact our operations, right? Maybe it's impeding ambulance traffic from getting to the facility. Maybe it's preventing family members from coming and visiting someone. All these different things that occur. You notice that a lot of these are going to have some overlap, right? So severe weather, earthquakes, terrorism, all these different things obviously impact the community as a whole, which then turn around and impact our operations at our facility. Now, business continuity is one that we have started to talk about and hear about a lot more after 2020, after COVID-19, and after some of the large scale disasters that have happened. And there's kind of this idea that healthcare is immune, right? That we serve the community, whether it's hospitals, long-term care facilities, assisted living, dialysis centers, regardless of what type of healthcare industry you work in, we all kind of think, oh, well, people need healthcare and we have to come back, right? We're a different type of business. We're going to rebound from this. But disasters don't actually discriminate against healthcare facilities. As a matter of fact, healthcare facilities are just as likely to close and never reopen their doors after sometimes even what we would call a minor disaster. And when we say minor, it doesn't mean that the impact was minor, but it does mean that perhaps this wasn't a community-wide event. Maybe it just had a larger impact on that facility. And we tend to refer to these in our industry as large losses, right? These are things that are so catastrophic within the facility, whether it's a fire, a flood, just any type of water loss. These are things that if you're not properly prepared for and you don't know how to mitigate and remediate, can cause you long-term issues. And any type of healthcare facility being out of commission is not only terrible for the business side of it, but it's also terrible for the community. So as we set the stage for what we're going to talk about over the next little bit, I want you to keep in mind that there are some steps for response and recovery that the CDC has laid out. And this is going to be our focus today as we move through this. And at the end of the presentation, I'm going to kind of share some action items that you can put into place before, during, and after an event to help you successfully recover from these different events that we're going to discuss. So healthcare emergencies that tend to be fairly common to us and occur more often than not, and these are our true emergency events. They may impact the community, but especially if we're receiving direct impact from them, this is where we have issues. So the big five that we're going to talk about today, we're going to break down fires, we're going to talk about water losses and utility failures, wind events from severe weather, hazardous material spills, and we're going to talk about infectious disease outbreaks, but not just from a COVID perspective. We're going to talk about actually the things that occur inside a healthcare facility on a fairly regular basis. So with fires, this is always an interesting one because we do fire drills. We have the life safety code, NFPA 101 in place, and everybody does fire drills, right? This is this big, huge thing. And if you're, any of you are fans of The Office and you've seen the fire drill episode, you kind of know that's how most of them, tend to happen. Maybe not with that much insanity. If you've never seen that clip, highly encourage you to pull it up on YouTube. But fire drills tend to go one way or the other, right? There's a lot of stress involved, or it's one of those things that everybody just kind of ignores until something really truly happens and somebody goes, hey, I do smell smoke, or I see smoke, and now, well, what do we do? So these are some statistics from NFPA. A lot of fires annually still happening in healthcare facilities. And then that one right down at the bottom is kind of what's so concerning to me. Fires happen from 8 a.m. to 6 p.m. Busiest part of the day with the most people in the facility. Interestingly enough, just about a month ago, and I've got this the kind of the information in here, but many of you may have seen on the news, there was an assisted living facility in New York. It was a high-rise fire. 13 residents were injured, one was killed, and there were 2 firefighters injured. All right, so the idea that fires may not occur in healthcare facilities, or that we're extremely protected from these events, really doesn't hold as true anymore as it used to. And how we handle these events before, during, and after can definitely impact when we talk about business continuity. So what causes these fires? Well, cooking fires are the big one. Having responded to a few of these fires in my healthcare days, it's very common for things like food warmers to overheat, for things to short circuit in the kitchen. There's grease fires, all these different types of things that can happen, and they cause the majority of these events. Now, if you look at this, nursing homes and assisted living facilities, they make up basically half of all the fires in healthcare. So if you're with us today and you're in that industry, some of the things you want to think about, right, is the size of your building, how it's laid out, how many stories you have. High-rise facilities obviously are a larger concern for evacuation and moving patients out and residents out. You also have the age of the facility. How strict is your adherence to your regulatory guidance and codes? Because all these things play a factor in how quickly a fire spreads and how quickly you're going to be able to deal with it in the moment. So let's look at a quick case study here. And this was a situation that we worked on. And it wasn't that the fire itself was the largest concern. It was actually the soot and smoke damage that occurred after the fact. And when teams got in, there was actually very little signs of exterior damage, right? Some smoke residue on the wall. It looks like one of these things, oh, we could just clean this off. But here's the thing you have to think about. An extinguished fire, will still create smoke, right? And that smoke is going to travel inside of walls. It's going to go above your ceiling tiles, and it's going to leave deposits of what is called carbon black. And carbon black is the byproduct of all these things that burn off from a fire, and it is carcinogenic. It's one of those things that we've seen not only be an issue to firefighters in response, but also to facilities and businesses down the road, because now this lives in the insulation, it lives above the ceiling tiles, and anytime it's disturbed, it migrates, it's inhaled, and over long term, it can cause cancer. So one of the things you have to think about with fires is that they need to be thoroughly investigated and properly remediated anytime you deal with them. Now let's move on to water damage for a minute. All right, the primary damage of this, and it doesn't matter necessarily where the water is coming from, whether it's overhead loss from a pipe bursting, whether it's a flood event, they're extremely common, and they cause a major disruption to patient care, right? Because you can see just in this photo to the right there, this is a lot to deal with and clean up and try to get through, right? This is now a health hazard because who knows what's in the water. And it's also going to impact business operations when you have losses in critical areas. So one thing that happens a lot, because the amount of water that's used in the area, is sterile processing, right? A water loss in a sterile processing area not only shuts down that area, but it also shuts down what? Our operating rooms, right? OR goes out of business. Now we have major financial impacts to the hospital, major impacts to patient care. And this is going to be something that if we don't deal with it fairly quickly, this is going to create issues, and it's going to cost a lot of time and money to get it back running properly. So from secondary damage, we're looking at what happens if the water isn't properly taken care of and it's allowed to sit for a long period of time. So the big thing here is obviously mold growth, right? If water is left in these tracks and left behind walls, we think, oh, it looks dry, seems dry to me, right? We put some fans on it, but how do you really know? So if you don't check this out, mold is going to grow in any area that remains wet. It's not adequately dried quick enough. If you don't open the walls and kind of verify that this is all dry and truly remediated properly, you're going to create something like this picture here, which we like to refer to as hidden conditions. Okay, so this is going to be your temperature, your moisture inside the wall, and then drywall is a perfect food source for mold. So you're going to basically become a reservoir for long-term growth. And if you look back to anything about the chain of infection, you know that a reservoir is never a good thing.
And so, Chuck, we do have a great question here.
Absolutely.
How long does it take for mold to grow after a water loss?
That is a good question. So generally speaking, about 48 to 72 hours for mold to actually to start to germinate on a surface or inside of a wall cavity, because again, you've got your drywall material, your gypsum board, it's gonna love all that food. If it stays wet, you've got moisture, and then temperature is a big one. So it loves a warm, humid environment, and mold will grow fairly quickly. So that's why it's so important to kind of plan for this and go, hey, how are we going to get this dried and dried appropriately? So excellent question for that. Sprinkler heads, these are common. And this picture here, is a good example of what this is going to look like when something happens. And the problem with these is that this is something as simple as probably looking at that picture. My guess is a really tall worker and that ladder had a bad accident with a sprinkler head, and now we've got a major water loss. All right, so simple accidents can happen just from human error. Doesn't have to be some big catastrophic event to create a major catastrophic event. So your response plans to this are a must. So another good case study here to look at, a lot of water in places that it shouldn't be. If you look at just height, you can see on the right there, you can see the cabinet for the fire extinguisher. So that's going to be roughly waist height, probably walking down the hall, if not a little bit taller. So this is a lot of water, probably covering many floors of the facility. 146 bed hospital with a transplant center, which obviously we know is a major concern for infection control. So this is a very serious incident. Sewage line breaks, which means you have category 3 water, which is grossly contaminated, raw sewage floating around, not something we want to walk through, not something we want to take any chances with. So here's the things to consider. If this was your facility right now, how would you manage this? Is this acceptable to just get the water out of there and try to dry it? Or is this a longer term process that we're going to need to be involved in to really check and see where did this water go, right? Because if this is on the first floor, then maybe it's just on the first floor. If it's on 2, 3, 4, and up, chances are that it is also on every floor below, probably about 100%. The next one we'll talk about real quick is wind damage. All right, wind damage from any type of storm event, whether it's straight line winds, tornadoes, hurricanes, create a lot of physical destruction, but this is also usually going to include water damage as well, right? So as storms move through, they break windows, they tear off roofs. You're probably going to have rain with the storm. That rainwater is going to migrate into the facility and create issues. And if it's severe enough and you have enough structural damage, then you're definitely going to see broken pipes. You're going to see things ripped out of the wall, pipes exposed. And so you're going to have leaking water from that as well. And now you have all that water mixed with other contaminants that are floating around. So rapid response to kind of secure the facility, and prevent this from getting any worse, right? We need to block those windows. We need to tarp roofs. We need to start looking at, okay, how much of this is salvageable and how do we keep this from getting any worse and deteriorating further? So all your potential hazards that you have to deal with, and these are things for those of you on that have ever had to do a hazard vulnerability analysis or risk assessment for your facilities or your residential communities for long-term care and assisted living. Where you're at and what you're dealing with all has different impacts, right? Thunderstorms pop up very quickly, move through with straight line winds and can do a lot of damage on very, very short notice. The same with tornadoes. Hurricanes, you have a little bit more time to prepare, and maybe you can do some mitigation efforts on the front end to kind of maybe stave off a little bit of the damage. Most of you on here that work in the healthcare side are probably going to recognize this photo from Joplin, Missouri, the F5 tornado that had a direct impact on a hospital facility there. It's a regional medical center, and this has become one of those major lessons learned for how we deal with things. What are we going to do when there's windows blown out and our generators are destroyed? What's our long-term recovery for this? Now our facility, we have to take care of our patients inside. We can no longer serve the community, and this is going to be unusable for an extended period of time. Now evacuations and property protection become kind of our primary concern with that. Sarah, before I move on, I just want to stop and see, do we have any other questions that have popped in?
You're being very thorough. So only things you've already answered.
All right, perfect. So here's an interesting one to kind of start to change this a little bit and talk about hazardous materials spills. Now, the issue with these is that they're not as common, and it's not something we deal with a whole lot, and it can create a lot of issues because of that, right? So when we're not dealing with things as often, it becomes a little bit more of a problem. And these could be known chemicals that we use internally that helps a little bit, because now we've probably got safety data sheet for them. We've got somebody that uses them every day. We probably should have PPE, accessible cleanup kits that now we can manage a spill. But external chemicals that come in that we're not familiar with can create some issues here. So this here was a life flight, hospital wing, air evac, whatever you have in your area, lands on the top of the facility. There's a fuel leak, and now we've got jet fuel running down into a facility, which creates a lot of issues. And hazardous materials don't have to just be chemicals, right? They can be bodily fluids. We have things like chemotherapy drugs, cleaning fluids, any hazardous substance that are going to require a rapid response from trained individuals. So this is something you need to consider about, even if it's a small spill, are your people trained to adequately go in and deal with this? And then what are maybe the long-term effects of this? Because there can be secondary damages from this. Chemicals migrate, and some chemicals, once they're on a surface, can create even long-term health hazards. Give you a quick example of one that was kind of a major almost remediation effort from when I worked in the healthcare facility, and that dealt with people bringing in, we'll say, external recreational narcotics and attempting to manufacture them in something that was called shake and bake methamphetamine back in the day. And if those chemicals explode inside the hospital, now you have some major concerns, not only damage to personnel, but damage to the facility. And you really need to think about, how would we clean that up? That specific example is not as common anymore, but there's always concerns about people presenting to the facility and bringing things in with them that don't necessarily belong. The other situation with this is those external events, and this is, again, people presenting, but you have a hospital decon team, and this is kind of specifically for hospital facilities, but any facility that is designed for healthcare, the general population is going to kind of view this as, maybe I can go there and get help. So even with external events, petroleum events, so gas, diesel, are very common. Your more serious events like terror attacks, obviously you have to plan for and look at these, but your day-to-day stuff like this is what happens, right? There's a simple accident out on the road. Now there's a hazardous material spill and people are coming and looking to get help. The biggest thing that you want to know here is just protect your facility, right? There's a quick acronym that I love, and it's called RAIN, and it stands for recognize, avoid, isolate, and notify. It's just basically recognize that there's a hazard that you don't want in the facility, avoid contaminating your facility, isolate the individual that's been exposed, and then notify the proper people to come in and help you out with it. So our case study on this one is fairly interesting, and I want to kind of run through the breakdowns of this, because this was an internal chemical that was utilized by the facility, large metropolitan hospital, had to evacuate 3 floors of this. So this was in New York. Basically 150 people were forced to evacuate the 18th, 19th, and 20th floors just around 11:30 in the morning. The chemical was flammable, so it could cause severe burns, eye irritation, lung irritation. Major response for this, right? A lot of people come out, a lot of external resources, unclear how much of the chemical got released. And then you had firefighters injured as well. Spill was finally contained about an hour and a half later. So again, what would you do if this occurred, and how are you going to handle it? Now, one of the last of these that we're going to talk about, and I'm going to spend a little bit of time going through this, is our infectious disease outbreaks. And we've spent a ton of time over the past year discussing COVID-19 and the pandemic as a whole. But what we really want to talk about today are the internal hazards that we deal with, right? So HAIs are a massive problem, right? Healthcare acquired infections, healthcare associated infections, about 120,000 infections and 19,000 deaths from MRSA alone, MRSA. Methicillin resistant staph infections are going down a little bit, but they're still extremely high and they're still extremely common. You have about 100,000 deaths every year with nearly 2 million cases of HAIs, right? And so we all know this is something that somebody came into a healthcare facility, they didn't have an infection, or at least they didn't have this infection, and now they acquired it from the facility. And the big thing with this that we worry a lot about is that things like mold, specifically Aspergillus, are becoming major healthcare concerns, right? As we continue to expand our facilities, we do excavations outside, and we're kicking up all this soil and dust and dirt. Aspergillus lives in the soil. It enters the air and then it gets pulled into the facility via air handlers. How well is your HVAC working, right? Are you testing for this stuff? Are you actually looking at it and going out there and saying, okay, I have these construction projects going on, and I'm going to jump to this next slide on that. We've got internal construction, we've got external construction, we've got remediation efforts going on from another event. How is this impacting it? Keep in mind that construction projects can be a contributor to HAIs. American Society for Healthcare Engineering says 5% of deaths from HAIs are construction related. All right, so you need to make sure, for those of you that have any involvement with selecting contractors to do any type of work in your facility, are you using an ICRA? Are your external stakeholders involved in that process? Do they understand it? Do they understand what it's like to work in healthcare facilities? These are all questions that you need to be asking and really diving into, because those other projects that are happening as we're doing demolition, we're tearing open walls. Hey, we had a water loss 2-3 years ago. Do we know if there's mold in that wall? Do we know what areas of the facility may contain asbestos? How do we know? How do we not know? Are we managing all of this? Because all these projects can directly impact patients' lives, patients' well-being, as well as your staff. So our last case study specifically deals with COVID, and this is, the big one that hit this year and last year, and we've all kind of really been playing catch up with this. And the pandemic overall has shown a lot of gaps in our preparedness practices for emergency management. And if you look at this chart specifically, we know that one of the things is that while there's been a major impact on hospitals, long-term care facilities really caught the brunt of very serious cases of COVID-19, a lot of the deaths from this, and that's taken a very large toll, not only on the business side of it, but also on the personal health and mental well-being of our staff and responders. So all these things, as we kind of wrap that up, really dive into how well are these things managed? How much of this are we really ready to deal with? And I would kind of challenge you that as we go through these next slides, think about, if this happened tomorrow, how would I rate my preparedness? How would I rate my response and my ability to deal with it? So all these events are going to have immediate impacts, right? This is something has happened and we have to mount a response and start to deal with it immediately. In those first kind of 12 hours of an event, especially the first couple hours, all we're worried about dealing with is health and safety of staff, health and safety of patients, health and safety of any responders, trying to manage our operational disruptions. Do we cancel elective surgeries? Do we, close these areas of the facility? Do we cancel all of our appointments? What do we need to actually do? And then trying to keep property damage from getting any worse, or immediately trying to do things like in this picture here. We need to get those things boarded up. We need to get some areas secured, because now we've got major slip, trip, and fall hazards. We've got debris everywhere. These are major concerns from a health and safety standpoint. First 12 hours of event, this is all we're really trying to manage and deal with. Now, short-term impacts, this is 12 hours going into days, maybe even weeks. Evacuations are going to happen within that first 12 hours most of the time. But if you look at any major evacuation, whether it's from a hurricane, a wildfire, or you've now had an event in your facility, tornado, hazardous material spill, you need to move everybody out. Evacuations most of the time are going to take longer than 12 hours. It varies by size of the facility, amount of personnel. But if you look at Hurricane Sandy in New York, to fully evacuate one of the facilities that got damaged there, it was about an 18-hour response. So a full scale, get everybody out evacuation does tend to take longer. You have to worry about patient and staff injuries. How are we going to manage these? How are we going to manage stress as this goes into a day and week kind of response? Business disruptions. If we can no longer provide care for the community, we can no longer perform surgeries. What does that do to the business as a whole? What kind of gaps does that leave in the community? Same thing that we've seen with COVID-19 this year. As time has gone on, one of the biggest issues that we kind of dealt with was people were delaying care, right? They didn't want to go to the hospital. They either couldn't or didn't want to go to their primary care provider. And so now we're seeing things start to tick up with cancer diagnoses being later than they should have been. And this is probably going to be a 3 to 5 year problem now, specifically because of one event. The other thing we need to manage is the media attention, right? If you have public information officers or communications team, make sure they are trained, make sure they understand how to work with the media, how to put messages out internally as well as externally to the community, so that everybody kind of knows what's going on and what's happening. The final thing we need to worry about is our long-term impacts. And this is, again, health and safety concerns, but long-term impacts from things, especially damage that was unresolved. And again, I go back to things like mold. We had a minor water loss, maybe we had a major water loss, and we thought we dried it. We thought we took care of it, but now 3 years later, we're upgrading an area of the hospital and we find out that everything inside the walls is covered in mold. How are we going to deal with this? The biggest business impacts to this really come from loss of faith by the community. And this is going to change the larger the disaster is, how well the facility deals with it. But truth be told is that the community needs healthcare, right? They need to stay open. They need you all to be there to take care of things. If you go back to Hurricane Katrina, there are all these stories about people walking through floodwaters to literally show up to the hospital to receive care, showing up to a dialysis center. People were taking boats to go to assisted living facilities and long-term care to visit their loved ones and to check on them and trying to even evacuate them at points. So the better job we do of managing a response to an event, the more the community is going to get behind us, the less business disruptions there are, and long term, the better it makes us look, right? That community faith is vastly important. So let's talk about some management strategies for this. And we're going to talk about mitigation, preparedness, response, and recovery before we start to wrap up. Now, mitigation, and you're going to sometimes hear mitigation and restoration, especially when you're kind of talking about the restoration industry. But mitigation, when we talk about it from an emergency management standpoint, is kind of doing these risk assessments, right? What's realistically likely to happen here? What do we need to be prepared for? What are our areas of concern? Right? How do we implement plans, processes? Where do we spend our money and time to try to lessen the impact of an event, right? So good example is earthquake construction, right? We build buildings to be more resilient in case an earthquake ever happens, so that we're not just dealing with a flimsy building that's going to fall down like Lincoln logs when something happens. And I realize I may have just dated myself by saying I played with Lincoln logs, but community groups that are going to require increased resources, right? What makes up your community? Do you have a large elderly population? Do you have a community that speaks multiple languages that may all of a sudden present to your hospital, and now you need to take care of them? If you're long-term care, assisted living, how are you going to communicate with families that something has happened? So you need to think about working with your insurance carrier to know what you're covered on. You need to work with external partners to see what type of response you can realistically expect. There's nothing quite as bad as picking up the phone, thinking that you're going to get help, and the company that you're wanting to show up, the vendor you're expecting to have supplies for or from, they can't get to you. Right. And it happened a lot this past year, and it's continuing to happen. So we need to make sure those relationships are in place. And that kind of brings us to preparedness. Right. Create your plans, test them, make sure they work. That's a big one. Got to make sure that what you've written out is actually functional. Can you do it? Can your people perform it? Make sure your people are trained on it. Nothing quite as bad as having a plan or a policy that sits on a shelf. Nobody's ever seen it. Now the disaster happens. Doesn't have to be a major disaster. It could be a small emergency. And so, well, why didn't you do this? Why didn't you have that? Well, I was never trained. All right. So make sure you're not just stopping at writing plans. Make sure people can actually implement them. Strong partnerships with external stakeholders, right? Your vendors, fire department, law enforcement, public health, right? All these people that you count on and you go, wow, I hope if I pick up the phone and call that they come to the rescue or they can come help. Establish those relationships beforehand. I tell people every class I teach, you want to pick up the phone and know who you're talking to. All right. You don't want some abstract person. You want to be able to call and say, hey, I'm going to call Chuck because I know he can help. I know he can get it done. Right. Whoever that is for you, make sure you know that person. You've got their contact information ahead of time. Understand things like incident command. If you're in healthcare, you're probably familiar with these. They are regulatory requirements that you be familiar with them, but you need to understand how you deal with an incident, how you respond to it, and then how you interface with the larger community as a whole, right? Where does everybody fit in and how do all these roles pan out? MOUs and MOAs, make sure you have agreements in place with people to provide services. It's huge, and it's something that gets missed a lot. Exercises and drills. You've written the plan, you've trained your employees, now test them and make sure they can actually do what you expect them to do. Now with response, most of this goes into that immediate short-term and long-term impact. The whole goal of response is to start getting back to normal, right? We want to evaluate what's going on, report it up the chain, contain the hazard, try to keep it from getting any worse. We want to protect our critical infrastructure, want to get back to patient care. Right? Make sure that everybody's taken care of, make sure things are handled, restore our essential services, and then get communications ready because the media is coming and inquiring minds want to know, right? Now, recovery, this is a very specific list of 14 steps from the CDC. And this deals specifically with a lot of the weather events, right? Water and wind, and then fires in your facility. How do you deal with this? So all these things like restore your working sewer system, extract standing water and sewage, right? So this doesn't become a long-term health effect. Getting the water back on is paramount, right? You need it not only to drink, but especially in a healthcare facility. We talked about sterile processing earlier. Water is the one utility that it's very, very difficult to utilize in a healthcare facility. If you don't have it, you're probably not actually going to be able to perform your operations that you need to. Containment is critical. We talked about HAIs and construction and all these things. If you have any type of work going on, containment and ventilation, negative air is massive to make sure that we're not contributing to healthcare acquired infections. Getting that contaminated material out of the way. Talked about things like mold and asbestos, right? Make sure you're doing ACM, asbestos containing material testing. We need to make sure that we're not contributing and making more hazards, right? So make sure people are properly in PPE, geared up, and they know what they're doing to take care of this stuff. Surface contamination, properly cleaning, disinfecting, getting this stuff out of there. Make sure that you're dealing with somebody who knows what they're doing. Make sure your people understand the differences between things like cleaning, sanitizing, and disinfecting. Repair the structure, getting things back to normal. Maybe if we're lucky, we even get them back a little bit better than normal, right? So we go, well, never was fond of that room anyway, so now we're going to upgrade it, right? Sometimes you can take advantage of that. Residual moisture is huge. You've got to make sure you're testing to make sure that everything is dry, that we're not now becoming a kind of just a place for mold to grow and hang out, right? Nobody wants a mold party in the walls. Not good. All right, restoration of electrical power. Getting the power back on always is a good thing. Make sure that everything's working correctly. We get refrigerators, freezers back on. Hopefully you've got that stuff hooked up to your generators. Always check, always test. Don't ever assume. Make sure everything gets thoroughly cleaned. Evaluate all your equipment. Hey, is it working correctly? Make sure you're bringing in somebody to test and verify all this. And then at the very, very last, before you ever assume patient care after any of these types of events, clean and disinfect any area where there's going to be patient care. So this is kind of a lengthy list. I'm happy to, as we move on, I'm happy to supply these slides to anybody that would like them. We'll give you some information at the end, but these are really good specific steps to kind of make sure you're ticking through to go, okay, you know, did we get this done? So before we move on, I want to kind of throw another poll up here real quick, Jordan, if you will. And we want to know if you've ever actually had to use an emergency restoration contractor before. You know, have you had any of these events where you've had to bring somebody in and deal with this? Know as you're responding to the poll, we'll share those results here in just a second, but kind of my final thoughts on this. You know, emergencies and disasters really can occur with little to no warning. And most of the time, those that pop up very quickly, those are the ones that create a lot of major disruptions to healthcare operations. They catch us off guard, and now we're scrambling to just respond and get things to happen. Be prepared is probably my best advice to you. And I know that sounds very simplistic, but think about, if you take a moment, think about the things that you never want to happen. All right. I hope this never happens while I'm on shift or I'm in charge of this, right? Because I never want to have to deal with this. Think about that thing or those things, and now imagine that it happens, right? And think about how ready you are right now to deal with that event, and think about the things that you're not prepared for, you're not ready for, and how do you take those steps to prevent all those things, right? We don't want the loss of revenue. We don't want loss of community trust. We definitely don't want total failure of the business and where we have to close drastically community needed items down. So my takeaway for you all today would be to take action, to realistically look at these things and said, if it happened today, how ready am I to deal with this? So with that said, Sarah, I'll ask real quick, do we have any questions in the chat or anything?
Yes, we do have a good question here, just asking about how can you ensure that an external partner or contractor is experienced in health work specifically?
Education and certifications and experience, right? When you're having anybody come into a healthcare facility, make sure that they've got some sort of documented education and training to work in healthcare facilities specifically. Make sure that, you know, they're kind of an industry partner with groups. You know, anybody that works with ASHE is always somebody that I would look at. And, you know, what's their experience, right? What healthcare facilities have you worked in? You know, how much background do you have in this? And looking at those things really will help you kind of start to understand, you know, what you're looking at and what they really do. So I just happened to see this one pop up in the chat. Said, what certifications do you specifically recommend they have? So I'm going to give you a couple examples. ASHE has a certified healthcare constructor designation, the CHC. It's kind of the sister or brother to the CHFM, which is the certified healthcare facilities manager. Look for somebody in an organization with the CHC credentials. ASHE also has the certified healthcare physical environment worker certification that is a big one to look at. It's a fairly, you know, simplistic training, but it's really good training. They have a great working in healthcare handbook. I have my CHC PEW certification. Another thing is just even an industry that invests in certification. So I can tell you, just for us, we do a certified healthcare restoration technician class. It's third-party certified. We had everything that we created vetted out. And we require people that are working in healthcare to go through that 3-day class and actually really learn, like, hey, here are the differences in healthcare, and here is how what we do makes an impact on the patient care environment and the environment of care overall. So with that said, I want to do a little housekeeping real quick. First and foremost, thank you very, very much for your time. I always tell people that time is the one commodity that you're not getting any more of. So I hope that I've used an hour of your day and an hour of your life wisely. Hopefully the presentation has been beneficial to you. If you have any questions about the presentation, if you would like a copy of the slide deck, or even if you have an interest in a private class for your team, maybe we can do this presentation for your group. Anything you want, we can always talk about. So you can reach out to your local BluSky business development manager for all of that information, and we can get it to you. Do want to remind everybody in the chat box before you leave, please, there is a survey link that is going to pop up. I would absolutely love for you to take a moment, complete our survey. It's also going to pop up as a link when you leave. Kind of lets me know that I'm on the right track and doing a good job. So that will pop up. Last thing, August 18th, we're going to expand on this a little bit more and talk about contamination in healthcare facilities, specifically from things like mold, asbestos, a variety of different topics. I would highly encourage you to go to the website, and the link is there. We can send it out to you as well. And we want you to join us in August for that one. So with that, Sarah, do we have any other questions, anything before we leave?
I think we're good to go.
All right, awesome. Well, everyone, thank you very, very much for attending today. Hope you have a great rest of your week and stay safe. Thank you.